He could have chosen comfort, prestige, and a ride in a leather-bound limousine. Instead, he chose a feverish little girl, a long walk in the rain, and a promise that would change everything. By the time the clocks in Hale and Mercer Tower slid past 7 in the evening, most of the polished executive floors had emptied into silence, leaving only the hum of ventilation systems and the faint glow of recessed hallway lights stretching across marble and glass. Ethan Carter was still working. A white American single father in his mid-30s, Ethan had broad shoulders shaped more by labor than the gym, tired brown eyes that never fully lost their kindness, and the steady silence of a man who had learned to carry more than he ever talked about. His Navy maintenance uniform was damp with sweat from the long shift he had put in repairing electrical failures on 3 different floors after a sudden systems malfunction threatened to delay a multi-million-dollar client presentation. For the people who occupied the top offices, the crisis had been an inconvenience. For Ethan, it had meant another hour added to an already punishing day, and another knot of guilt tightening inside his chest because his daughter was waiting downstairs. 8-year-old Lily Carter sat curled on a lobby bench beneath the soft light of an oversized chandelier, wrapped in a pink raincoat, her small cheeks flushed with fever and her blonde hair falling in loose, tired wisps against her face. Lily was a white American little girl with a gentle voice, large blue eyes, and a recurring autoimmune illness that came and went like cruel weather, leaving her weak, cold, and drained. Ever since her mother died 2 years earlier, Ethan had built their life around small promises that gave Lily stability, and the most important of all was simple. No matter how hard the day became, he would walk her home himself. It did not matter if it rained, if he was exhausted, or if the city was already swallowed in darkness. That walk was theirs. It was when Lily talked most, when she leaned against him without needing to be brave, and when Ethan felt for 20 precious minutes that he was doing one thing in the world exactly right. Outside, rain slammed against the glass front of the tower in silver sheets, while thunder rolled above downtown Chicago, and Ethan had just reached for Lily's backpack when the mood in the lobby changed. A line of assistants, executives, and security personnel suddenly straightened as Victoria Hale stepped through the revolving doors. Victoria, the company's billionaire CEO, was a white American woman in her late 30s with sharp gray-blue eyes, flawless dark brunette hair, and the kind of elegant control that made people lower their voices when she entered a room. She wore a fitted charcoal coat over an ivory blouse, and every movement carried the confidence of a woman who had built an empire through intellect, discipline, and a refusal to bend for anyone. She was admired, feared, and rarely questioned. That night, after hearing from operations managers that Ethan had stayed late all week helping prevent a disaster during a high-stakes corporate push, Victoria paused in the center of the lobby and publicly thanked him. Her voice was crisp, carrying easily through the space as she praised his work ethic and loyalty before turning to the waiting black limousine outside, its chauffeur already holding the rear door. In front of employees who stared with open amazement, she offered Ethan and his daughter the use of her personal car to take them home in comfort. The offer landed like a spotlight. For people who worked in the building's lower departments, riding in the CEO's car was not just a favor, it was a symbol, a moment of elevation into a world of tinted windows, hand-stitched leather, and privilege usually visible only from a distance. Some employees smiled for Ethan before he had even answered, as if the decision had already been made. But Ethan glanced down to Lily, who was shivering softly and leaning against his side, then looked back at Victoria with respectful calm and said, "Thank you, ma'am, but no." Silence dropped so completely that even the rain outside seemed to pause. A few coworkers blinked in confusion. One of Victoria's senior executives actually shifted, as though Ethan must not have understood the offer. Victoria herself stared at him, not angry at first, but stunned in a way she probably hadn't felt in years. "You're declining?" she asked, the question edged with genuine disbelief. Ethan nodded once. He explained that when Lily's fever got bad, she hated cars, especially silent ones that felt too big and too cold. What soothed her was their walk home. She liked the sound of his voice, the rhythm of their steps, the way he let her stop whenever she needed, and the feeling that no matter how sick she was, her father had chosen to be beside her the whole way. He said it simply, without drama, as though the answer should have been obvious to anyone who loved a child. "She needs me more than she needs a nice ride," he said. Lily looked up at him with sleepy trust, and Ethan tightened his hold on his shoulder. Around them, people were not just surprised anymore, they were unsettled, because in a building designed to measure value through hierarchy and access, Ethan had quietly declared that something else mattered more. Victoria's eyes flicked toward the rain, then back to the child, then to the limousine waiting like a polished symbol of everything she had spent her life building. For one brief moment, she seemed unable to translate what she was hearing into the language she understood. Then she stepped aside. Ethan thanked her again, adjusted Lily's hood, and guided his daughter into the storm, carrying her backpack in one hand and the umbrella in the other. Through the tower's glass facade, the entire lobby watched father and daughter disappear into the rain, while the luxury car stood unused behind them, shining and silent. The city felt colder once Ethan and Lily left the glow of Hale and Mercer Tower behind, but the farther they walked from the building, the more the world seemed to belong to them again. Rainwater streamed along the curbs in silver ribbons, streetlights glimmered across the wet pavement, and traffic hissed by in distant bursts, while Ethan kept the umbrella angled carefully over Lily's head, taking the worst of the rain onto his own shoulders. Lily's small hand stayed wrapped around two of his fingers, warm despite the fever burning in her skin, and every few steps she leaned more heavily against him. Ethan slowed without ever making it look like a burden. To anyone watching, it was just a tired father and a sick child crossing downtown in bad weather, but for Lily it was routine, ritual, and reassurance all at once. "Daddy," she whispered after a few blocks, her voice raspy with illness, "you could have taken the fancy car." Ethan looked down at her, his mouth softening into the smile he saved only for her. "I could have," he said, "but then I'd miss my favorite part of the day." Lily frowned weakly. "Walking in the rain?" He chuckled under his breath. "Walking with you." The answer made her press closer, and even through the exhaustion, he saw a little of the fear leave her face. That was why he had said no. Since her mother's death, hospitals, medicine, and nights of frightened waiting had become too familiar. Ethan could not cure Lily's illness with love alone, but he could keep his promises, and sometimes promises were what gave a child enough strength to keep going. He let her choose whether they crossed at the next light or the one after, asked if she wanted to count the red taillights reflected in puddles, and listened when she began telling him in a fading, sleepy voice about a picture she had drawn that afternoon of the two of them walking under a giant rainbow. Far behind them, a black limousine rolled slowly through traffic. Inside, Victoria Hale sat in silence, watching through rain-streaked glass as the man who had refused her generosity kept stopping to kneel beside his daughter, zip her coat higher, or brush damp hair from her forehead with tenderness so instinctive it almost felt invisible. Victoria had told herself she was only trying to understand what had happened in her lobby, why a man in Ethan's position would decline a gesture most employees would spend years hoping to earn. But the longer she followed them, the less certain she became of her own motives. Ethan was not showing off. There were no executives around now, no audience to impress, no strategic benefit to what he was doing, yet every movement of his seemed guided by values so fixed that weather, exhaustion, and public opportunity could not shake them. Victoria found herself unsettled by the contrast. The interior of her car smelled like polished leather and expensive cedar, warm and dry and perfectly insulated from the chaos outside. Yet for the first time, it felt strangely airless. She had spent more than a decade teaching herself that care meant provision. Provide resources, provide bonuses, provide protection, provide solutions. That was how strong people loved. That was how successful people helped. But Ethan had turned all of that down because what his daughter needed was not efficiency or luxury. She needed his time. She needed his full, undivided presence. The simplicity of it struck Victoria harder than any criticism ever had. When Ethan lifted Lily into his arms to carry her across a flooded intersection, the child laid her feverish head against his shoulder with total trust, and Victoria felt an ache move through her so quietly that at first she almost missed it. She had won awards for leadership, been featured on business magazine covers, and negotiated deals that changed markets, but she could not remember the last time anyone had leaned on her like that, not for what she owned or commanded, but for who she was. Ahead, Ethan stopped under the awning of a closed pharmacy so Lily could rest. He crouched in front of her despite the rain soaking through his knees, looked her in the face, and asked if she wanted him to carry her the rest of the way. Lily shook her head and said she wanted to walk, like always. Ethan nodded like she had made a brave and important decision, then held out his hand. A young woman sheltering under the same awning glanced up from her phone, noticed the scene, and quietly recorded a few seconds of Ethan zipping Lily's coat and kissing her forehead before they stepped back into the rain. Neither Ethan nor Lily noticed. They were too wrapped in the private world of each other's presence. Victoria, however, saw everything. She saw how Ethan bent his pace to match Lily's without hurry, how he made room for her weakness without making her feel like a burden, how his devotion had nothing performative about it. And somewhere between one red traffic light and the next, Victoria began to realize that perhaps true leadership was not proven by the power to command comfort, but by the willingness to carry responsibility without being asked. When Ethan and Lily finally turned onto a quieter residential street lined with aging apartment buildings and narrow pools of yellow lights spilling from windows, Victoria told the driver to stop farther back. She watched as Ethan scooped Lily into his arms for the last stretch, her little face tucked into his neck, both of them drenched and exhausted, and she sat frozen as something inside her shifted. In the distance, there was nothing grand about the image. No boardroom, no cameras, no applause. Just a father choosing his daughter over everything else. Yet Victoria had never seen anything look more powerful. By the following morning, the city had moved on from the storm, but Hale and Mercer had not moved on from Ethan Carter. The video recorded beneath the pharmacy awning had spread first through neighborhood accounts, then local Chicago pages, and then into broader social media feeds under captions praising a father who turned down a CEO's limousine to keep a promise to his sick daughter. The clips were brief, grainy, and imperfect, but maybe that was why they landed so hard. There was no soundtrack, no polished narration, no dramatic editing, just Ethan kneeling in the rain to pull up Lily's zipper, Lily clutching his hand, and the simple tenderness of a man who treated his child's comfort as if it outranked the rest of the world. By 9 in the morning, employees across Hale and Mercer were whispering over coffee, replaying the video in break rooms and on office monitors. Some were embarrassed that they had silently judged Ethan the night before. Others felt a strange pride that someone from their building had become the face of something so human in a company often accused of being anything but. Ethan himself wanted no part of the attention. He arrived after dropping Lily at her pediatric specialist's office with a neighbor who helped on treatment days, and by the time he reached the service entrance, he already knew people had seen the clip. Coworkers smiled at him in a way that made him uncomfortable. One clapped his shoulder, another called him legend, a word that made Ethan nearly wince. He did not feel like a hero. He felt tired, worried, and behind on work orders. Upstairs, however, Victoria Hale sat in her office staring out over Chicago with the video paused on one of her monitors. She had watched it more times than she cared to admit, not because of the public reaction, though that reaction had been impossible to ignore, but because she could not stop examining the expression on Ethan's face when he looked at Lily. There was a kind of certainty there that she envied in ways she did not yet know how to articulate. Victoria's own life had been built through sacrifice. She had missed birthdays, ended relationships before they could complicate her schedule, and trained herself to see emotional needs as distractions that weakened focus. Her father had once told her, years before she became CEO, that the world only respected women like her when they never appeared soft. She had listened. She had become formidable, efficient, untouchable. But now she was beginning to wonder whether in protecting herself from vulnerability, she had also walled herself off from the most meaningful parts of being human. Ethan's rejection in the lobby had not humiliated her. It had exposed a blindness she had dressed up as strength. Around noon, Victoria requested Ethan's personnel file. She learned he had not taken a full vacation in 2 years, had used nearly all sick days for Lily's medical appointments, and had never once missed a maintenance emergency when called. She learned his supervisors described him as exceptional, selfless, and more reliable than policy. She also learned something that sat heavily with her. The company's rigid attendance protocols had forced him more than once to choose between unpaid leave and his daughter's care. That fact stayed with her long after she closed the file. Later that afternoon, she walked the operations floors herself, a rare enough event that conversations stopped as she passed. Instead of delivering instructions, she listened. She heard from a payroll coordinator raising two sons alone, a systems analyst caring for an aging mother, a receptionist who had hidden panic attacks because she was afraid flexibility would be seen as weakness. One by one, people answered Victoria with cautious honesty, and with each exchange, the company she thought she knew began to look different. Beneath its polished success, there was strain everywhere. Quiet sacrifices, exhausted parents, caregivers running on guilt and caffeine, people staying loyal to a place that rarely acknowledged the cost of their loyalty. By evening, Victoria had made a decision. The next morning, she called a full company meeting in the central atrium. Hundreds gathered, expecting some guarded statement about the viral attention. Ethan stood near the back, wishing fiercely that he could disappear into the wall. Victoria stepped onto the platform without notes. Her expression was composed, but her voice held a gravity that quieted even the most cynical executives. She said that companies often praised dedication without asking what employees were giving up to provide it. She admitted that she herself had mistaken comfort for care and efficiency for compassion. Then, in a moment that stunned the room, she said that an employee had shown her a clearer model of leadership than any boardroom seminar ever had. She did not over-dramatize Ethan's choice, but she honored it. She spoke about presence, about the dignity of showing up for family, about the failure of workplaces that force people to choose between their job and the ones waiting for them at home. Then she announced sweeping reforms, flexible scheduling for parents and caregivers, expanded paid family leave, emergency transport support for dependents, and revised attendance rules that allowed managers to treat caregiving as a legitimate responsibility instead of an inconvenience. Murmurs spread like wind through the atrium. Some employees looked shocked, some looked relieved enough to cry. Ethan stood motionless, feeling every eye in the room threaten to turn toward him even before Victoria asked him, gently, to step forward. He did, awkward and red-faced, and Victoria did not praise him as a saint. She simply thanked him for reminding her that people are not most valuable when they are most convenient. They are most valuable when they remain true to what matters. In that moment, something changed, not only in policy, but in culture. And for the first time in years, Hale and Mercer felt less like a machine and more like a place where human lives were allowed to exist. The weeks that followed did not transform everything overnight, but the shift inside Hale and Mercer was real enough that even longtime employees spoke about the building differently. Parents who had once hidden calls from school nurses now answered openly. Managers started asking not only for updates on deadlines, but on families. The new caregiver policies meant fewer terrified calculations between rent and unpaid leave, fewer guilty apologies from employees racing to hospitals or home emergencies, and more quiet gratitude than Victoria would ever hear directly. Ethan noticed the difference in small ways first. His supervisor stopped making him feel like every specialist appointment for Lily was a personal inconvenience. The front desk receptionist smiled when he left exactly on time. One afternoon, a colleague with twin toddlers admitted that Ethan's story had given him the courage to request a schedule adjustment he had needed for months. Ethan listened, nodded, and went back to work, still uncomfortable with the idea that a decision which felt so natural to him had become a company legend. At home, life remained modest and difficult in all the ordinary ways it always had. Their apartment was small, the radiators knocked at night, and medical bills still came with alarming regularity. But Lily began to improve. Not in a miraculous, movie-like way, but gradually, beautifully, the way real healing often comes, through treatment, routine, safety, and the body's slow agreement to trust the world again. Her fever episodes became less frequent. She laughed more, she ate more, and each evening, unless the weather became truly dangerous, she and Ethan kept their walks. Sometimes they took the long way past the bookstore with the painted window or the bakery that released warm sugar into the air at dusk. Sometimes Ethan carried her the last 2 blocks just because she liked resting her cheek against his shoulder. They talked about school, about the stray cat near the alley, about whether spring would come early. Those walks remained ordinary to everyone except the two people living inside them, which was exactly why they mattered. Victoria Hale changed too, though far more privately. She did not become suddenly warm or easy. Her standards remained high, her schedules intense, her instincts sharp, but the brittleness around her edges softened. She began visiting floors she used to know only through reports. She learned names she once would have delegated away. She noticed who stayed late, who looked exhausted, and who carried quiet burdens without complaint. More than once she caught herself standing at her office window in the evenings, watching employees leave the building and wondering what kind of lives waited for them beyond the polished lobby. She never told anyone that on 2 separate nights she drove through Ethan's neighborhood after late meetings and saw him and Lily walking home under the streetlights, the little girl in the yellow cardigan she had graduated to now that the worst of winter was over, the father whose work boots still looked too worn for the life he deserved, and the easy rhythm between them that money could neither stage nor purchase. Victoria did not ask the driver to stop. She simply watched as Ethan bent to listen to Lily say something urgent and delighted, then laughed in a way Victoria had never once heard inside the office. The sound lingered in her mind long after the car pulled away. That night, back in her quiet penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and museum-perfect furniture, Victoria stood alone with the city spread beneath her and finally allowed herself to name what she had learned. Success without connection was just performance. Wealth without someone to share time with was a kind of beautifully decorated emptiness. She had spent years mastering the art of being impressive, and Ethan Carter had shown her, without ever trying, that a life becomes meaningful not through status, but through presence. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across the city, Ethan tucked Lily into bed, kissed her forehead, and listened as she mumbled sleepily, "Thanks for walking with me every day." He sat beside her until she drifted off, then looked around their little room, at the medicine bottles, the stuffed rabbit on the pillow, the tired lampshade, and the peace on his daughter's face, and felt richer than any executive in Chicago. Because in the end, the most valuable thing he had ever given his child was not comfort, not money, not a ride in a luxury car. It was himself. And that, Victoria now understood too, was the kind of wealth that changed lives. If you enjoyed this emotional story, subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more powerful single dad and billionaire CEO stories filled with drama, heart, sacrifice, and unforgettable endings. Don't forget to like, comment, and share if you believe love and presence matter more than money.